right? I mean, he admitted that he had just gotten over COVID. He was positive for COVID. Had none of this been caught on video, it's likely that George Floyd's death would have just been another COVID death, right? The police would have ignored everything else and they would have said he died of COVID-19. In my opinion, the only thing that these officers did wrong in this entire encounter is that once George Floyd became non-responsive, they didn't do anything to try to revive him, right? I mean, they had already called the ambulance, so they knew an ambulance was coming. And again, if they had intended to murder him, why would they call an ambulance? I mean, clearly they didn't. But you can argue that their response to the situation once Floyd became non-responsive was negligent, that they should have acted in a better way to potentially save Floyd's life. And whether they could have done that, we have no idea. I mean, he may have had so much drugs in his system that there's nothing the officers could have done, right? His fate may have already been sealed, but we'll never know because they didn't really do anything except waiting for the paramedics. And in fact, even after the paramedics got there, you can see in the footage, because, you've got the body cam footage from the officer who got into the ambulance with Floyd and who tried to help revive Floyd with CPR, but it seems like they waited an awful long time. At least a minute seemed to go by before they did anything in the back of the ambulance. Now, maybe had they acted sooner, maybe his death could have been avoided. I mean, we'll never know, right? But that's not murder, right? At best, it's manslaughter, but even that would be a stretch. And this is the problem here, because the officers have already been overcharged. What are we going to do now? What is the Minneapolis Police Department going to do now? Because if they were honest, based on this exculpatory evidence, right, which they actually had from the very beginning, clearly they had the body cam footage. I mean, it was just leaked to the public, but they had it the entire time, right? And it's exculpatory. It proves that there was no murder, right? So at a minimum, they need to drop the charges from second-degree murder to maybe manslaughter, right? But even that, I think, would be extremely difficult to prove if the officers were following the proper police procedures. Now, those procedures have since been changed, but they were in effect at the time. And if the police were not given proper training on how to react to a suspect who is this high on drugs, whose fault is that? Is it the officer's fault for not being properly trained, or the police department's fault for having not trained them properly? But the problem that they have now is if they even drop the charges to a lower charge, that's going to, result in outrage, probably more riots. But what might even be a bigger riot is, what if these guys are acquitted? Because based on this evidence, I don't see how any lawyer can lose this case, right? If you put the officers on the stand and they testify, and I think they're all going to testify because I think their testimony will exonerate them, I don't see how you get a conviction. Because remember, all they have to do, all the defense has to do, is raise reasonable doubt. They don't have to prove that the police are innocent. All they have to do is raise a reasonable doubt that maybe they're not guilty. And the body cam footage does that all by itself. The autopsy does that all by itself. You put the two together, and I don't see how you get a conviction here. So that means when they're acquitted, now there's going to be more riots. There's going to be more looting. What the left has to do, if they really want to diffuse this situation, they have to come out and admit that they were wrong, right? That they misjudged this situation. But again, they can't do that because they need this as proof of systemic racism. They built this entire movement on this lie. So now what do we have to do? I mean, do we actually have to try to find a jury that will ignore all the evidence, all the facts, and convict innocent men of murder and put them in jail just to appease a mob, just to avoid more violence and more looting? Should we ask innocent men to go to jail to maintain this farce, to maintain this false narrative. I mean, do we really need more political prisoners in the United States? But this is the predicament that we are now in. And, I would suggest, again, watching the body cam footage while it's still on YouTube. I mean, I'm kind of surprised that YouTube hasn't taken it down. And my reaction is very typical. Look at the comments. I don't care which version of this video you watch on YouTube. You look at the comments, and 90% of the comments are, oh my God, I had no idea. These guys aren't guilty. Even people who originally believed, right, the narrative, once they have seen the actual evidence, they have changed their mind. And there are a lot of people who are outraged. Why wasn't this shown sooner? I mean, I was led to believe something that wasn't true when the police had in their possession the entire time evidence of the truth. And they deliberately withheld this evidence to foster a false narrative, even as people were dying in the streets. Even as more people were losing their lives, including black people, were losing their lives, and the police had in their possession evidence that would have put this in its proper context and maybe would have saved those lives. But the fact that they didn't want to release the footage that would have saved lives proves, right, that black lives don't matter. Only it proves it in the opposite way that Black Lives Matter contends. Because it wasn't that Floyd's life didn't matter. It did matter. The police actually tried to save his life. Right? Maybe they could have tried harder. Maybe they could have tried better. But they did try to save his life. But the lives of other black individuals who died in the streets and of white individuals, those lives didn't matter at all to the police because they were willing to sacrifice those lives in order to push this false narrative to advance their socialist political agenda.